Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Karen Kornbluh, Director of the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative here at the German Marshall Fund, the United States. We're very delighted to have Dan Mullaney, who's agreed to join us today to fill us in on the status of the TTC and where we go from here. Dan, as you all know, is the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East. We're big enthusiastic supporters of the Trade and Tech Council, which in many respects builds on GMF Task Force's recommendations for greater transatlantic cooperation. One of the conclusions that I saw coming out of Saclay was, as recent events have proven, strong transatlantic bonds and cooperation on issues related to trade, technology, and security are more important than ever. We couldn't agree more. I'm going to ask Dan a few questions, and then about halfway in, we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience. I would ask you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll read off the questions to Dan, and he will feel free to answer the questions that he wished he'd been asked if he doesn't want to answer exactly the question that we're asking him. Dan, welcome. Thank you so much. I'm going to just start by asking you a broad question. One of the things that was said in Saclay in France at the last meeting last week was that the foundation that we cemented through the TTC was indispensable for fostering the unprecedented level of cooperation on export controls and sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We plan to continue coordinating our actions to mitigate the negative impacts in the global economy and towards improving supply chain resilience, fostering predictability and trade diversification. We share a desire for cooperation in defense of our security and to supporting information exchange and so on. I'm just wondering how the Russian invasion of Ukraine built on what was already there at the TTC and maybe shifted it a little bit, and what we can expect to see, what we achieved, and how you think things may be a little bit different now than what they would have been without Russia's terrible invasion of Ukraine.
Well, thanks very much for the question, Karen, and thanks very much to GMF for sponsoring this panel. I think Russia's atrocious further invasion of Ukraine was a serious confirmation of what we already knew fundamentally, which is that the United States and the European Union have massive common interests based on common values of democracy, transparency, rule of law, not shared by everybody in the world, and that it's critically important that we coordinate, that we work together to pursue those interests. We knew that already. I think that has been amplified over the past year. And it was really given that sense was given a strong boost by Russia's further invasion of Ukraine. It is useful to note the context over the last year, where we have really had an unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination with respect to the EU overall. You recall that we addressed a 17-year-long dispute in civil aircraft, addressed those challenges, and also addressed the very significant retaliatory tariffs that had been in place. We addressed the significant common challenge that we have with respect to non-market economy excess capacity, and addressed the very significant tariff retaliation that was in place associated with that issue. And we also addressed ongoing issues that were occurring with respect to the unilateral imposition of digital services taxes, moving those to a much better cooperative forum. So the whole theme and trend over the course of the last year or more has been towards a more collaborative, supportive approach with Europe, where we look to pursue our common challenges, pursue our common objectives. So in this sense, the TTC, I think, was a bit of a culmination of that, a physical manifestation of the goal of setting up and structuring a more collaborative approach, more forward-looking approach with respect to the European Union. Not that we ignore our differences, not that we don't address the differences that we have between us, but realize that those differences are really not very significant compared to the common challenges we have, the shared values and the interests. We set up the TTC a year ago, and it was set up in light of, particularly in light of the newer technologies, emerging technologies, to coordinate US and EU approaches to those technologies as they arose, and also to deepen our transatlantic trade and economic relations in a manner that minimizes, or you're not going to eliminate, but minimizes difference between us, and that promote our shared democratic values. So the first ministerial for the TTC was in September in Pittsburgh, after having been set up in June. And our second ministerial was, as you mentioned, in Paris, Saclay, a research hub outside of Paris. The TTC is very broad, as you intimated. It covers digital access for small and medium-sized enterprises, critical supply chains for semiconductors, solar, other issues, coordinating closely on emerging technology standards so that we maximize the extent to which we can trade with each other in a way that reflects our values and that also pushes back on those that do not share our values. Export controls, investment screening, a range of other things. I think because that scope is very broad, I'd like to focus on something that I and USTR is particularly focused on, which is the area of global trade challenges. It's one of the working groups that cuts across a lot of the issues. But in that working group on global trade challenges, in September at the ministerial, we identified 3 or 4 baskets of issues we were going to pursue. One is to avoid unnecessary barriers between the United States and the European Union, avoid unnecessary barriers as they threaten to arise due to emerging technologies, new technologies. Second was our coordination in defending ourselves and our common interests against non-market economy policies and practices. And then third, and this very much goes to the core of Ambassador Tai's agenda in trade, which is focus on worker-centric trade policies. We agreed that we would work closely with the European Union to promote fundamental labor rights through trade policies. We also mentioned in September that we would be looking into how trade policies can support our environmental objectives. So what we've done between September in Pittsburgh and May in Saclay is fill out the specific agreed activities that we would undertake under each of these categories. So in the first category of avoiding unnecessary barriers to trade, we agreed that we would sit down and consult as new regulatory and other initiatives come forward, and particularly with respect to newer and emerging technologies, with a view to maximize common approaches to those technologies, but also to avoid unnecessary bilateral barriers to trade, recognizing we're maybe going to have different political objectives in each of our regulatory approaches, and we don't mean to interfere, of course, with those regulatory objectives, but we recognize that there are also barriers that can arise that interfere with having a robust transatlantic marketplace and that don't need to be there to serve that regulatory objective. So we're going to agree to talk ahead and address those. We also agreed that we would work together to reduce or eliminate common barriers that we face in third countries. This is a very cooperative approach vis-a-vis third countries. And we also said that we would look for specific products and sectors where we can facilitate bilateral trade by avoiding things like duplicative product testing and inconsistent product testing to facilitate bilateral trade in that space. And of course, and you referenced Russia's further invasion of Ukraine. reflective of that situation, we also agreed we would identify measures to help us both expand trade with Ukraine. In the second area, having to do with pushing back against injurious non-market economy policies and practices, we said that we would coordinate and consult with respect to our own domestic measures that we have in place to push back against non-market economy policies and practices, with the view to increasing their effectiveness. We have some tools, the Europeans have some tools, they're developing more tools. Clearly, if those tools are used in parallel or in coordination, we can increase the effectiveness of what we do vis-a-vis non-market economy policies and practices. Second, and equally importantly, we agreed that we would minimize the chance that those domestic measures would create collateral damage for each of us. You know, if they have an objective of pushing back against non-market economy policies and practices, there's always the risk that there's going to be collateral damage. So if we consult, we can minimize the chance of that happening. And we also agreed that we would develop joint or coordinated strategies to counter the effects of harmful effects of non-market economy policies and practices in particular sectors with respect to particular practices. And that's one of those areas that we will be pursuing now to identify particular sectors for which that would be a useful exercise. We noted that medical devices seem to be a good issue to be discussing, but we're hopeful that we'll be identifying others. And then in the third area of supporting fundamental labor rights, we established a transatlantic labor dialogue that will enable labor interests, the unions, but also businesses working with the labor interests to advise us and to make sure that we get ongoing, high-level, committed input into what the United States and the European Union should be doing to support workers, particularly as we're talking about a just transition towards sustainable, resilient, green, digital economies. There's a whole transition underway, and there's a strong desire to make sure that transition is just, that it focuses on workers, on labor rights. We're also planning to work together to improve the enforcement of labor standards in third countries. Again, we each have our own tools, we each have our own set of FTAs, other tools, and we're going to work together to try to jointly improve the implementation of those labor standards. And we're also going to work together on issues of encouraging, incentivizing responsible business conduct when it comes to things like forced labor in supply chains and other issues. On environment, we laid out some cooperative work that we can do to make sure that trade policies, both of our trade policies, are supportive of important environmental objectives. And also, and this was I think a new factor clearly arising after Pittsburgh. We also launched a food security dialogue in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has pointed out some significant food security issues. And the United States and the European Union, as significant agricultural producers and exporters, I think are well positioned to have a dialogue and to take measures to try to ensure food security. So what happens now? I mentioned we set up this very broad TTC in June. We had our first ministerial where we identified areas of focus in Pittsburgh. This ministerial identified specific initiatives, which I've outlined some of the key ones when it comes to global trade challenges. What we're going to do now, between now and the next ministerial, is actually implement these things that we've said we were going to do. Implement or start implementing them between now and the next ministerial. At the same time, we are going to be engaging with thought leaders, stakeholders, others, to see what it is that we can do with respect to these initiatives or even additional ones to make sure and that includes, by the way, those who are participating in this panel who, from tradition, I've been involved with GMS activities for a really long time, and this is all, these are the deep thinkers in transatlantic relations. And so with the input and advice of those, such as those on this panel, but other stakeholders, we'll look to develop and fill out these initiatives in a way that ensures that our work remains relevant, stays meaningful, stays concrete. So, the May 16th in Saclay, Paris was kind of the starting gun for the next goal, which is filling out these initiatives and actually accomplishing some of them. And we're going to very much look forward to input from stakeholders, and I'm very much going to look forward to input and questions and comments from those in attendance at this event. Thank you.
That was a great overview. Thank you so much. So I want to go back and pick apart some of the things that you said, because our audience, I think, is a combination probably of trade and people who are more focused on tech and a little less on trade. But when you were telling us some of the tensions that have been plaguing the US-EU trade relationship, you went over some of those quickly. And I wonder if you have anything you can tell us specifically on two things that are very interesting, I think, to this audience. One is resolving the steel dispute with this methane agreement. If there's anything you can say about that, I just thought that was such an interesting agreement. It hasn't gotten as much attention as I think it warrants, but it seemed very win-win-win. And then where we are on the tax agreement, I saw that the Secretary General of the OECD said that things are going more slowly than we had thought. Is there any light you can shed on either of those past tensions that we're trying to, get through?
Sure. Yeah. On the first issue, our industries, the steel and aluminum, were facing significant challenges from non-market economy policies and practices, and so we obviously had to take protective measures. We think that those of the objectives we had to avoid the injurious impact of non-market economy excess capacity were objectives that were shared by many around the world, including the European Union. So what we did was agree to eliminate the tariffs that were in place to protect historic levels of trade. So first step, allow the trade to resume, but then also to start working with the Commission on a global arrangement in which we can incentivize trade in steel that is not subject to non-market excess capacity and other non-market economy practices, and also facilitate trade in steel that is environmentally friendly. So you mentioned win-win-win. I think that's true. The objective, and that's still under discussion, is to find a resolution to the common challenge that we have that involves incentivizing market economy steel, incentivizing clean steel. So it is it's a new approach. I think it's something that is very interesting. It's under discussion, so I don't have a lot of details that I can provide. But that's the objective. And it was, I think, as you said, a win-win-win way of resolving something that had become an irritant in US-EU relations, and get us on a common track of pursuing the common objectives. On the digital services taxes, to be honest, what we did was we moved it out of the chain in which we were having investigations of these unilateral taxes, which we thought was inappropriate coming from a number of countries around the world, and moved it into a discussion among parties in the OECD. Once we got to that point, I I can't myself comment on exactly how the OECD discussions are going. That's really a focus of other agencies. But we did, shifted into that track and out of a track where we were investigating those unilateral measures and putting it into a much more cooperative forum. I mean, the whole theme, I think, and it's not just of this panel, but the theme of our relations with Europe is that, we do have differences in approaches. We do have differences. Those differences are insignificant compared to our joint interests and the differences that we both have between ourselves and third and other parties around the world. And so what the last year reflects is an increasing focus across the board to move things into an area where we're collaborating, cooperating, not ignoring the differences between us, not, where we will continue to work on those, but to emphasize to a greater extent our common objectives and our cooperative approaches.
So one of the things on that score that you mentioned was this, a common approach to non-market economies. And you talked about Europe having tools and us having tools and how we would work together on those. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit for a less trade focused audience and tell us what you mean by those tools. And in one of the questions, someone points out that Ukraine is mentioned 30 times in the statement coming out of Saclay, but China is not mentioned. And so I assume that when we're talking about non-market economies, China is one of those economies that we're focused on.
Yeah, no, clearly that's that's right. I do think Ukraine and the horrendous situation of Russia invading Ukraine and everything that has happened there. As I said, it made it very apparent that we knew we needed to work together, and that's why we've been doing that for the last year. This really made it palpably clear that we needed to work together, and that, I think, is why there were quite a few mentions of the situation in Ukraine, which and it also that situation engendered a lot of other spin-off situations, food security being one, misinformation being another. There are just a whole host of things that were of immediate need for attention. But I do think that that we do have kind of an enduring challenge with respect to non-market economy policies and practices that is very much at the forefront of our thinking. Certainly not that we would ever ignore what's happening, and we need to respond to the situation and are responding to the situation of Russia and Ukraine. But we do have a long-standing, increasing, and enduring challenge with respect to non-market economy policies and practices, including excess capacity, subsidy, state enterprises, a whole range of issues that I think will continue to require attention. On the domestic measures that we each have, the United States has some tools in the form of Section 301 investigations of unfair trade practices that allow us to take certain measures. There are other tools like similar to that. That we have anti-dumping trade defense instruments. We have countervailing duty investigations that allow you to offset unfair trade practices. The European side has some of the same tools: anti-dumping, countervailing duty, safeguard. They're developing others that are underway: an anti-coercion instrument, a foreign subsidies instrument. And so what this statement does is says that as we deploy these measures to push back against subsidies from non-market economies or coercive activities or others, that will we'll be in consultation with each other to, if we can, help ensure that that our measures, that each measures that we take can complement each other, maybe create some leverage, and not work at cross purposes. So,
so could you talk about what that would look like? You mentioned medical devices. I know you don't want to show your cards, but could you further expand on that?
Yeah, I think that's the other aspect that we agreed to. In addition to talking with each other about whatever domestic measures we use, there are obviously or there are going to be certain sectors, maybe certain practices that present common challenges to both of us, because we have investments, we have industries in these various, we have companies in these various industries, various sectors, and to the extent that we identify common challenges with respect to those sectors arising from non-market economy policies and practices, we envisioned we would come together and develop a joint strategy. What exactly we would do is something we would have to work out in the specific context of a specific product or sector, but we would work together to push back against the negative effect of the non-market economy policies and practices for those particular sectors. And again, it's very much along the theme of identifying where we have common interests, and you have to be honest in saying we don't always have common interests, but see where we do have common interests, and then working together to pursue those interests.
Great. One of the things that was also mentioned in the conclusions in France was that trade and technologies can be pivotal to the ability of autocratic countries to implement authoritarian policies, perpetrate human rights violations and abuses, engage in other forms of repression, and undermine the security of other nations. And you had talked about labor, but I'm wondering, how can the US and the EU work together to promote, to push back on authoritarians, especially when we're talking about new technologies and their use of those?
Yeah, and I think that's probably a theme that that goes through a number of the working groups of the TTC, and there are a number of working groups that are focused on making sure that some of the technologies that can become tools of authoritarianism, that we work together to push back on those on that use of those tools. Focusing together on issues like misinformation, making sure that the use of some of the newer technologies, do what we can to make sure that they are not misused, and that they are used in a way that reflects our own values, our own standards. I think specifically with respect to some of the labor issues, and pushing support for fundamental labor rights, and combating the scourge of forced labor and child labor. I think that is a very particular area where the United States and the European Union clearly have common objectives, and can work together with companies, with our trade agreements, using various tools to push back on slave and forced labor, which does not only exist in non-market economies, but is present there and in other contexts as well.
I wanted to just ask you quickly about the standardization, which is also something that the tech folks who focus on tech policy have grown increasingly alarmed about over the years, that the US and the EU have less of a strategic approach to international standard setting organizations than we've seen coming out of China, and that both poses a competitiveness threat because Chinese technologies can become standards, but also some of these technologies that embed the ability to surveil more easily can become standardized. And I saw that there's this creation of a new strategic standardization information mechanism. And I wonder if there's anything you can tell us about that, how hopeful you are about that.
Yeah, well, the issue of standards, broadly speaking, is really important in this context, because as we are faced with the newer and emerging technologies, there is a need, in order for those technologies to work properly, to be interoperative. You need to develop standards, and how those standards are developed and the content of those standards is of keen interest to us and the European Union. And there's where in standards development or organizations, it's very important to us and to our stakeholders that US and EU values of transparency, openness, rule of law, those sorts of values, but also some of those that you mentioned that can be tools of authoritarian regimes, that the standards that are developed and that industries ending up complying with, that they do reflect our common values. And to do that, we need to have open communication, steady communication between the US standards development agencies and the EU ones, to make sure that we can coordinate in these international organizations, and also coordinate with respect to the underlying standards, and make sure that they are consistent with both of our values, which facilitates trade transatlantically, makes it possible or maximally possible for us to trade between the United States and Europe based on a common or at least not inconsistent set of standards, but also helps ensure that in this rush for international standards development, that we don't end up with international standards that run contrary to our values, which is a potential risk, especially in the international standards development organizations. So I think it's a very positive cooperative aspect that we have our standards people in a formal manner, able to talk to each other about these issues as they arise.
Great. So I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience, and they're pretty detailed. So here's one. When you speak of coordinated action with the EU, what would be included in the range of possibilities? For example, could there be a joint initiative to impose targeted tariffs on Chinese goods, the US using 301 and the EU using some comparable authority?
Well, I think in terms of what we agreed to do, I think we were conscious that we each had our own tools. It's unclear that the European side has tools that are like ours in that respect, and like those that the questioner mentions. So I wouldn't be able to say that particular situation would occur. It would be more when we do implement the tools that we each have, that we are supportive of those tools. And part and parcel of that is actually having some assurance that the tools will not have a negative collateral effect. It's easier to be supportive of the European use of some of their tools, and vice versa, if you have some level of confidence that you are not going to be hurt by the tool yourself. So there are two aspects to that, and it really applies to to the current domestic tools that we have and the ones that are under development.
Now, I'm not sure how how deeply you're involved in this, but there's been a lot of talk about the semiconductor industry, and both the US and the EU are planning to invest huge amounts of public funds. And so there's a question that will there be an attempt at coordination in the semiconductor industry? I know there was a statement that we're not going to have a subsidy war, but I wonder if it's gone beyond that to talk about how we avoid that subsidy war and complement each other. And this is what the questioner is asking about.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and the statement that came out of Paris Saclay is fairly detailed. I think it's something like 55 pages, and it has annexes with 10 annexes with subparts to those annexes. One of those is semiconductors, and then there are also annexes on solar and critical raw materials and other things. So there's an intense desire, specifically in the semiconductor area, because of the experiences that we had with supply disruptions and supply chain disruptions. There is a significant and particular focus on how we ensure the integrity of the semiconductor supply chains, and that involves a range of issues, including where there is manufacturing. And so I would say that on some of these issues in particular, and there's because of the experience with the supply chain shortages, there has been put in place, or will be put in place, an early alert system to where there might be supply chain problems, so that we can work to resolve those. I think some of these areas are probably worthy of their own in-depth panel.
Trust me, we're going to have one on semiconductors for sure.
Yeah, the TTC. What's interesting about the TTC is it is based on a single theme, which is we need to work together with the European Union to create a friendly transatlantic space that pursues our values, that push back against the values that we don't share. But once you break it down, it falls into lots of different categories, and probably, as you said, each one is worthy of a whole graduate school seminar, let alone a panel.
Well, we're a nerd fest here, so we plan to have all those nerdy follow-up, especially about semiconductors. So here, speaking of going down rabbit holes, but I don't know if this is too deep in a rabbit hole, but I think it's interesting. Someone asks, if we have agreed now to consult on new regulatory packages related to emerging technologies to avoid trade barriers, is this a formal process? And does it apply to the Europeans' new technology legislation like the AI Act and the Data Act? Or does it apply to particular elements, or is it more general? And then the same person asks, I'll throw this in too, and you can answer whichever parts you want to. The leaked draft of the conclusions indicated that the US and EU had agreed to full implementation of the protocol allowing alignment and conformity assessment for pharmaceuticals, but wasn't in the final version. Can you say why? I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah, no, those are both really good questions, and they're rabbit holes, but I guess they're my rabbit hole, so that's okay.
Yeah, good.
Not somebody else's rabbit hole. I might have bigger challenges. We have agreed that we will consult on these initiatives that might create unnecessary barriers to trade. Exactly how we do that, I mean, it will certainly be the officials on both sides who are working on Working Group 10, where we will scope out initiatives as they come and try to identify where unnecessary barriers might exist in some of those initiatives on either side. So we will have to define exactly how we do that. I think on both sides, we do have the advantage that regulatory and other initiatives, because we are, rules-based, democratic, transparent, it often becomes apparent when there are initiatives coming down the pike. The way this usually works is that we will see an initiative from the EU or vice versa, or a stakeholder will say, hey, these are some initiatives that the Commission is thinking about, and we think there may be some unnecessary barriers to trade. And then at that point, we would envision taking those up with our Commission counterparts. And I think without excluding, any particular vehicle. In other words, say, well, we can't talk about unnecessary trade barriers in this vehicle or that vehicle. So, from our perspective, it would apply across the board where there are unnecessary barriers. And it might be useful to distinguish two things. One is where there is a legitimate regulatory objective, and all of the elements of the regulation are tailor-made to achieving that objective. And that's a different situation, because that has to do with a policy choice related to ideally legitimate regulatory authority. Distinguish that from elements of an initiative that don't really serve the purpose of the regulatory objective, but can still create barriers for U.S. stakeholders when it comes to us, and EU stakeholders when it comes to them. So I think we'll be looking at any initiatives that risk creating those unnecessary barriers, and trying to avoid them. On the second question, we decided that this has to do with conformity assessment, product testing. We decided that we needed to have a more detailed conversation going forward and identify where the value added would be greatest in terms of streamlining testing, eliminating double testing, however you would address a barrier that arises from conformity assessment. So we opted not to identify any particular sectors at this point, but to work on pragmatically on specific issues, and identify them in this period between after Paris Saclay and the next ministerial.
Great. Somebody else asks a similar question about a different topic in terms of a leaked draft. She asks, a leaked draft of the joint statement in April included a, quote, climate peace clause, but that language was dropped in the final statement. Could you shed any light on what happened with the language, and if conversations are ongoing? And what is a climate peace clause? That last part is from me.
Yeah. I can't. I didn't actually look at any of the things that came. I saw that there were things that came out and said, "Oh, here's a draft." Yeah. I didn't actually look at any of those to see what they were, because they don't have any. They don't have any.
Maybe you could talk. You talked about the transition, the green transition. Could you talk about that a little bit more? What's contemplated, what's going to be worked on, and then if you want to throw in, I know there's a lot of concern right now about tariffs on solar panels, and if that's at all part of these discussions.
Yeah, sure. I think the transition to a green digital economy in our working group comes up in the context of the sort of the labor pillar, and specifically in the context of getting labor input into what we should be doing with the European Union. So recognizing that a lot of the transitions that can occur as we adopt new technologies, as we adopt green technologies, as digital technologies emerge, it can create a sense of concern and worry on the part of workers and unions as to what it means for regular people, for workers. And so we're looking to collaborate closely with the unions and also the businesses working with the unions to maximize the extent to which we're sensitive to those issues and can address them. And part of Ambassador Tai's focus on a worker-centered trade policy is that with respect to every initiative we undertake with trading partners, it's not a question of just doing the same thing as was done before, that we're always asking the question, okay, who does this, what are we doing? Who does this benefit? Who does this not benefit? Are we taking the steps that we need to take in trade policy, which is not every aspect of U.S. policy, but in trade policy, to ensure that the benefits are spread evenly and that they address some of the concerns of some of the workers and some of the communities who think that believe they have been left behind by globalization.
So the person who asked the question had a follow-up or expanded on it, and I wonder if you could point us to how we could find out more about this. Apparently, the language in the draft was, in light of the critical role of energy supplies and the need to fight against climate change, we commit to refrain from trade defense measures targeting either side's green and energy transition support schemes. Which working group do you think that would have been from? And if we wanted to get more information on that, where do you think we would go?
Well, I don't know, because as I say, I really did not look at any of the things that were out there. I mean, I think certainly, and I think this was clear in the Pittsburgh statement that came out in September, and in this one as well. We do have very significant environment and climate change related policies, both in the United States and the European Union. And I think we're also convinced that trade policy, while trade policy is not climate policy, it's not environment policy, but trade policy can support the policies that are made to address climate change, to address challenges. So we are clearly going to be discussing with the European Union all the various ways in which our trade policies can support our environmental and climate change policies. In our working group, we identified that we would be doing this in international organizations, and we reinforced that we'll have a close collaboration with the EU on that. As to what specifically we might agree on to support our climate policies, I think that will be subject to further discussion between the US and the EU.
Is someone else has followed up with this? I hate to keep putting you on the spot about it, but I know it's just a great general interest, and we can move on from this if you don't have anything to say about it. But someone asked, isn't the problem that a number of people in the US believe the carbon mechanism in Europe is a trade barrier?
I think that I would hesitate to be specific on any particular measure, but I think pretty much across the board, we and the European Union, I think, want to make sure that the regulations and initiatives that we have in place are tailored to meet the objective and don't cause, one way to put it is collateral damage. I use that expression in the context of China, but also that they don't create unnecessary barriers to trade. I mean, in some instances, you have a regulatory objective and it is, going to create some kind of a barrier, broadly speaking, because that's often what regulations do. But the question is it unnecessary, and can it be, can the objective be achieved without that barrier? And I think as a general matter, we would be looking to avoid those kinds of barriers.
Well, thanks for being patient with all these questions. I think we've decided that we need to have a semiconductor event. Now we need to have a green tech trade event as well. And I really want to get to the bottom of what's going on with the solar panels. But someone asked a really good question, which is, while the U.S. is engaged with the EU, to what extent does the U.S. incorporate or appreciate the interests of the U.K., which may diverge from those of the EU?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, we are, as many on the panel may, or attending the panel may know, we have been engaging in we call them dialogues with the UK. We've had 2 deep dialogues with the UK. One in Baltimore in March, and then another in Aberdeen in April, both of which I had the pleasure of attending. And many of the broader themes, especially in terms of pursuing worker-centered trade policies, and much of the input that we received from stakeholders, is somewhat along common themes. I would say when it comes to the TTC, we're very much dealing in the first instance with the Commission as a bilateral matter. But we also recognize that in some of these areas, we may be able to achieve our objective better by also consulting or working with other partners. And so I certainly wouldn't exclude that kind of thing when it comes to the UK. I think specifically, in the ministerial statement, there was reference made to the trilateral discussions the United States, the EU, and Japan have been having on non-market economy policies and practices. And that's an example of where you do have a format that can help reinforce what we do bilaterally. But I think it's clear that a lot of the shared values, the shared interests that we have with the European Union that has driven us toward this very cooperative agenda in the TTC, many of those values and interests are those that we also share with other trading partners.
And is there, I'm wondering also about this brand new Indo-Pacific economic framework. Are those 2 things in parallel, or do you see those meeting up at some point in some way?
Well, a common theme here is that several years ago, as many of you will know, we were engaging in an FTA negotiation with the EU. A couple of years ago, we had 5 rounds of an FTA negotiation with the UK. Some may recall we had a TPP negotiation with the Pacific many years ago. I think what we're seeing now is a reflection of asking how do we best shape an initiative that's appropriate to the partner. And the FTA TTIP negotiation with the EU, that didn't work for whatever reason. So we designed the TTC very much to be focused on the cooperative elements, and move forward in specific areas. Not everything's agreed, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed, but actually, moving forward on a bunch of different fronts at once. With the UK, we're having this dialogue to determine what our best next steps are with the UK. And I think other initiatives around the world are very much in the same spirit, looking at the region, looking at our interests, and asking basically, okay, what is the best way to achieve our objectives and our joint objectives in the region. And in each region, the answer is going to be different. It's not going to be in every case FTA, FTA, FTA.
Got it.
It's going to be much more tailor-made to the region, to the partner.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm just gonna ask one other question and then let you tie it up by telling us what we can expect going forward. Another thing that those of us in the international tech space have been focused on is the China's Belt and Road Initiative, and how often that is both a problem in terms of Chinese state loans that impose a burden on third countries, but also that it's tied to Chinese telecommunications and digital infrastructure that is often quite insecure. And one of the outcomes of the recent meeting was a pledge to combine EU, US, and international development financing to help countries choose Western alternatives to these kinds of loans. Can you tell us anything about that?
I mean, I think that's another area where a specific dedicated panel would probably be useful. There is a fair amount, in just the few minutes we have left, there is a fair amount of discussion in this Paris-Saclay statement and in the ICT rather annex on that issue and others. So it is in that issue is in a way part of the broader challenge of pushing back against injurious non-market economy policies and practices, injurious both in the United States and in the EU, but also in third countries in a way that negatively impacts us. But there is a specific working group in the TTC that is focused on those issues.
Great. If you don't mind just zooming out as you leave us and maybe combine, where do we see things are going next? There's going to be another meeting, I think, in December. So what do you hope to see? And then before we started this, you were talking to me a little bit about how this is really, and I think you've touched on it in your answers, how this is sort of a different approach to trade as opposed to, as you were just saying, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed, liberalization for liberalization's sake. I wonder if you can provide us both things in tying up. Where do we go next? And how is this, how would you frame this as a different approach, maybe a pivot from the past?
Yeah, no, happy to do that. I don't know exactly when the next TTC ministerial is going to be. I mean, the last one we went in September and then in May. The exact scheduling is not clear to me, but so we'll be targeting between now and whenever that next ministerial is to actually accomplish some of the things that we set out. And I think this really applies to all of the working groups, but speaking the one I know best, the Global Trade Challenges Working Group, will be looking to actually point to some specific, meaningful, concrete things that we've done between now and the next ministerial in each of these areas. And I think the general question that you raised is we're very much in the TTC, as with some other trading partners for which I'm responsible. We're not automatically going back to the old way that we were doing things. Like we were doing an FTA with the UK, so let's keep doing an FTA with the UK. Or we were doing TTIP with the EU, let's keep doing TTIP with the EU. I think every initiative that we have, we're asking the question, okay, what is it that we're doing? Who is it benefiting? Who is it not benefiting? Is it leaving anybody behind? And so rather than a precise checklist of exactly what we're doing in all these different areas, it's a set of questions that we're putting to ourselves with respect to each of these initiatives and talking to the EU. Are we helping workers? Are we helping real people? Are we addressing some of the concerns of those who feel left behind by globalization? So it's a very, and the TTC, it does reflect a much more than in the past, perhaps a cooperative approach with the commission, where we're not sitting down as in an FTA and each side trying to convince the other one that they should agree to a common set of obligations. We don't need to do that. We need to look at areas where we can cooperate together and work together to achieve an objective. And it may mean that we don't do it in exactly the same way, which one often does in the context of an FTA, but we can move towards the objective in a complementary way and do it on an ongoing basis. That's the other aspect. As I said, we're hoping to achieve some concrete results between now and the next meeting. And there won't be a question of holding everything back until we have a big package agreed. We're going to try to harvest as we go, and that's a function of it being maybe a more cooperation focused approach.
It's really interesting. I imagine that it makes your job more complicated, but also more interesting.
Yep.
I really appreciate your sharing so much with us and being patient with all our questions and giving us an agenda moving forward. And we hope we can follow up with you. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and attended, but most of all, thank you, Dan, so much.
Well, thank you for hosting, and thanks for the very interesting questions. Really appreciated it all. Thank you.
And thanks to the GMF team, Julia, Lauren, Nicole, and William, for all your help. Thanks. Bye-bye.